what are we doing? What are we doing? Are we going to fill Congress with rich people because the Supreme Court says they can spend anything they want?
She was a high-fashion model, working mother, and community activist who set a high standard for ethics in Congress.
We've got to be a little less arrogant. I really mean it. I think that we ought to approach people with less certainty that Daddy knows best.
To readers of Doonesbury, she is the beloved heroine of Capitol Hill, the Honorable Lacey Davenport.
It's a question of spending money that we haven't got for the programs that we know we need. And we're going to spend it for something disgusting and beneath the dignity of this nation.
And she pursued the ideals of America's founding fathers, who believed that politics should be a temporary public service, not a lifelong profession. This is the story of one of the most outspoken women in American political history, Millicent Fenwick.
The business of government is justice. And look what injustices government is capable of.
Between 1975 and 1982, Millicent Fenwick served 4 terms in the United States House of Representatives. The New Jersey Republican was a political maverick who often shared the public's contempt for congressional behavior.
Congress is a very fascinating lesson in a lot of things. And you find in Congress exactly what you find in the world. There's no difference. At the bottom of the heap of the most deplorable members of Congress are people on the make who are going to use every perk of office that they can lay their hands on, who are going to go beyond that into accepting things that they know darn well they shouldn't accept, who are going to vote for things they know darn well are damaging rather than constructive.
It is the pickpocket's way. We've done it in the sly, easy way so that nobody would notice. We can't do this in this country. The public is already alarmed at the method. If we need something, we should be ready to vote it.
Among her colleagues, Mrs. Fenwick was known as the conscience of Congress.
I remember going up to one of my good friends that I greatly respected in the House. For heaven's sake, you're listed as in favor of this bill. How can you? Listen, Millicent, if I don't vote for this bill, this turkey, I won't get the agriculture boys to vote for my turkey. See?
But, you know, I've got a lot I know said.
Her accessibility endeared Fenwick to her constituents.
I haven't time to go to the bank. There's my $5. Will you do me in? My name is Millicent Fenwick, House of Representatives, Washington, D.C. Okay? Or just Burnsville, New Jersey. Thank you. I'm glad you're doing it. Hi. I don't think arrogant people belong in power. Arrogance closes you off from other people. It makes you feel that you somehow, and that's another reason I don't like the word tolerance. That suggests a comfortable position from which you are willing to accept. No. Celebrate diversity, welcome diversity, applaud and respect diversity. This is what's good about our town. The children, the older people, the veterans, the firemen, the first aid squad, the auxiliaries. This is what makes a community. The bands and the people and everybody knowing each other. What would we do without our volunteer groups in our towns in America? What would we do if people didn't stick together and learn to love and know one another? This is why
these towns are good places to live. This is why they're good places for our children, for our future politicians, and plumbers, and policemen, and nurses, and doctors, and how we welcome you all. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And plumbers! Plumbers!
Fenwick's character offered the media an irresistible contrast to Congress as usual.
Millicent the Avenger, Millicent the eccentric, and sometimes, like Lacey Davenport in Doonesbury, who's modeled after her, the benevolent upper-class liberal clucking in French or Spanish or English over her troubled flock. Millicent Fenwick is also the woman who returns each weekend to Bernardsville, New Jersey, to a home filled with books and painful memories.
I have a terrific memory. It's extraordinary. Sometimes at Christmas lunches, I used to pray for a not-so-good memory.
Millicent Fenwick was born in Manhattan in 1910, the second child of financier Ogden Hammond. Her mother was Mary Stevens, a descendant of Revolutionary War hero John Stevens. When Millicent was 5 years old and her sister Mary was 6, World War I began in Europe. Millicent's parents left their children behind and sailed for England to aid the Allied war effort.
Mother was absolutely determined to start a hospital for the wounded, and absolutely determined. Now the war, after all, this was 1914-15, the Lusitania went down, I think on the 15th of May, 1915, and terrible, Daddy described it all. He was sitting after lunch with Mother and 2 other American women, friends, and they felt a shake of the whole ship, and I wonder what that is. So he went out, and on the deck was an officer striding along very quickly, and he said, it's nothing, please make sure that everybody keeps calm and sitting in the lounge, as they called it. Well then, of course, there came another tremendous shake, and then it started to list. And so they went out to the deck, and already there was trouble with the boats, and women and children only, you know. So Mother got into a boat. Daddy described it. She was short. My mother was not tall. And she turned to Daddy and laughed, dropped her purse on the desk, and I don't think I'll need this where I'm going. And so her handbag she dropped on the deck. She got into the boat, and there were 2 people holding they were lowered by ropes, but one of them was young and not very strong, and he couldn't stop it from slipping through his hands. So everybody in the boat was thrown into the water, women and children. And Daddy dove in, try to see if he could find Mother and get a piece of wood maybe. And he never saw her again. We were told about Mother's death, but by my grandfather's sister who lived nearby. And I didn't understand what she was saying. My sister did. She was about 2 years older than me. She started to cry, and my comment was, I've never forgotten crybabies. You see, in a way, doesn't that teach you something? Your automatic reaction from your own limited little training will give you these automatic reactions. How limited. And shouldn't we learn that if we aren't careful, this is what we're going to continue to do throughout life?
Years later, Millicent and her sister were sent to boarding school in Virginia. When their father was appointed U.S. ambassador to Spain, he took the children with him to Madrid.
When I got back from Madrid, it was just in time for the October crash of 1929. We'd been abroad, as you see, 3.5 years. So, and I wanted to go to Columbia, or at least take some lessons, courses in the Metropolitan, which was just down the street from the house where we lived in New York, 82nd Street. 18 East 82 we lived, and half a block. And the family wouldn't let me.
Millicent then fell in love with Hugh Fenwick, whom she described as sensual, irreverent, and married. The couple eventually wed and went on a flying honeymoon that ended when they crash-landed on their very first day out. The Fenwick's marriage produced 2 children, but lasted only 4 years. After her divorce, Millicent had to scramble to keep home and family together in the middle of the Great Depression. She was forced to demolish most of her family estate in Bernardsville, New Jersey, because she could no longer afford the heat and the taxes. The wing she left standing is where Millicent has lived ever since.
Look what happened to me. I was broke, 2 children, debts I didn't know about, and I wanted to get a job. I was not the kind that can invent a wonderful little business and, be hearing about it all the time. I just wasn't that kind. I didn't have that gift. And I wanted a paycheck. And I went to Bonwick Teller. It was air-cooled, and it was summer, and terribly hot. And so I stopped in, asked for the personnel department, and went from the magic, beautiful world that Bonwick Teller offers its customers to the more mundane personnel, little iron stair upstairs. Terribly nice young woman. I'm sure she was fresh out of Vassar. And she asked me for information. And what college did you go to? I said, well, I never went to college. I did take some courses in Columbia in philosophy. But she said, as a registered student, I said, no, a lot of extension. Oh, she said, well, you have a high school diploma, haven't you? And I said, no, I haven't. We left to go abroad when they wouldn't give me, they gave my sister a high school diploma, but they wouldn't give me one. And because I was 15, and they say we don't give it to people 15. So I said, well, couldn't I sell stockings? And she said, not without a high school diploma. I said, well, couldn't I be a runner? And they said, no, you're too old, you're 28.
What Millicent lacked in diplomas, she made up in style and ingenuity. She found work as a high-fashion model in the late 30s. The same year, she began paying attention to world events.
The first knowledge I had was Hitler. I mean, that's what got me interested in politics, which had frankly never interested me at all. And you'd think that maybe I would have gotten interested by USSR. After all, they started in 1917. Or even by fascism in Italy. They started in 1922. But no, why did I suddenly twig with this tremendous jerk of revulsion? It was a photograph of a poor man with an Iron Cross, which he'd won for bravery in the First World War, having to wear a yellow star. I thought, is it possible? Government doing this to human beings. Is it possible?
Millicent then parlayed her fashion experience into a writing job at Vogue magazine. Ultimately, she became Vogue's war editor and a political activist in pre-war Manhattan.
I was asked to speak in Yorktown, which in what was called, they said, the German section of Upper East Side, New York. And I did on the platform with a loudspeaker and not very enthusiastic crowd. And I spoke of, I can't remember exactly, but you can imagine the great traditions of Rome, equal justice before the law, tremendous contribution to mankind, society, and the great traditions of German science and music and philosophy. Okay, so when I came down off the platform, a group of young men said to me, so interesting what you said, would you mind coming around the corner here on the side street so that we can, without this loudspeaker, because there were other speakers, you see. So I went around the corner, and pretty soon I realized that they were not an enthusiastic group of young people who had been interested in what I had to say. Interested, perhaps, but furious. And pretty soon, it sounds impossible to say, I found myself in the gutter, on the ground in the gutter of the street, being kicked in the back, or killed over. And I was rescued by a soldier, a boy in uniform, who picked me up. And I saw myself in the door of the bar. He took me to a bar, and in the glass I could see. Everybody wore hats in those days. You know, it was all over one eye, and I looked out. And he said, "What in God's name are you doing coming to a place like this to talk like that? You ought to know better."
At the end of World War II, a simple telephone call turned Fenwick's attention to political issues that were emerging in the United States.
I was sitting in my office in Vogue. You won't believe this. In 1945, I think it was, telephone rang, and it was my cousin John Hammond, who was very much interested also in music, and he was a CBS man. And he said, "Millicent, listen, I want you to contribute to something." I said, "What, John? What is it?" I thought it would be some musical thing. He said, "It's the Committee for Justice in Columbia, Tennessee." I said, "What's that?" Well, this black serviceman came back on leave, took his mother down to the radio store with her radio. He got into an altercation with the owner of the shop because every white person that came in got served before this seaman's mother, and he was taken off to the police station, and he can't get a lawyer. I said, "What do you mean he can't get a lawyer?" "Well, no lawyer will take his case. And so we're collecting money here to have somebody that will take his case in Columbia, Tennessee." So I think I sent $10 or whatever I could afford at the time, but it alerted me, you see.
Fenwick retired from Vogue in 1952 after she received an inheritance. She spent the next 20 years as a community activist devoted to civil rights, consumer protection, and prison reform. She was elected to the New Jersey Assembly in 1969, and 5 years later won her first race for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Fenwick began her congressional career at 65, an age when many elected officials are contemplating retirement. When she saw that many congressmen were behaving like princes instead of public servants, she used her new pulpit to criticize their motives for getting things done.
It's a question of spending money that belongs to other people that we haven't got for the programs that we know we need. And we're going to spend it for something disgusting and beneath the dignity of this nation.
On the House Ethics Committee, she tried to reform the system that often delivered the best legislation that money could buy.
"Oh, Congressman, how are you, Congressman? You're certainly doing a wonderful job. Oh, Congressman, we're so proud of you." You know, blah, blah, nice, everything. And then, "We have a bill, Congressman, we'd like you to co-sponsor." "Oh, tell me about it," said Don. And so he started to tell him about it. Don said, "Well, that does sound interesting. I'd like to see it." Voice on the other end of the telephone changed abruptly. "No more Congressman. Hey, buddy, we're friends, aren't we? We contributed to your campaign. Friends don't ask to see a bill before they co-sponsor it. What do we say?"
We've got to be a little less arrogant. I really mean it. I think that we ought to approach people with less certainty that Daddy knows best.
New Jersey's Millicent Fenwick has earned a national reputation for her willingness to stand up and fight for what's right and what works for people.
You know, I'm called the conscience of Congress. I'm not particularly anxious always to be taking this role, but nobody else will do it.
Millicent Fenwick for United States Senate, because experience is important.
By her fourth term, Fenwick was frustrated by her party's minority status in the House. She felt she could be more useful in the Senate, which then had a Republican majority. Throughout the 1982 Senate campaign, Fenwick maintained her normal standards of campaign behavior. She would not campaign in New Jersey while Congress was in session because she felt her constituents deserved full-time representation. She tried to negotiate a limit on campaign expenditures with her Democratic opponent. And she refused campaign contributions from special interest groups because she had witnessed their destructive influence firsthand.
I couldn't believe it when in Congress one day, Lloyd Meade, I think his name was, he came from the West Coast, got up and said, I'm not going to run again. I announced to my colleagues here, I'm not going to run for Congress again. It takes $250,000 to run a decent campaign in my district for Congress. Imagine, I just spent $21,000. And he said, I get 10,000 from this group. I get 10,000 from that group. 5 in the primary, 5 in the general. I know, they know why they're giving it to me, and they know I know. And if I do what they want, I feel I've been bought. If I don't do what they want, I feel like a cheat. I've got 2 boys who've got to go to college. I'm not going to run again. I can't afford it. Now, what are we doing? What are we doing? Are we going to fill Congress with rich people because the Supreme Court says they can spend anything they want? Or are we going to put people of more moderate means, perfect public servants, under the obligation of deciding as Mr. Lloyd Meade said? I mean, it's very, very difficult. You can't just kiss it off.
Her Democratic opponent in the Senate race was a political newcomer who refused to play by Fenwick's rules. Frank Lautenberg donated millions to his own campaign, accepted many contributions from political action committees, and campaigned full-time across the state. Fenwick suddenly found herself in one of the most expensive Senate campaigns in American history. In the final weeks, she began borrowing against her assets to subsidize her own campaign, but she still refused to accept money from PACs.
This is what has happened to politics in the United States. And if you don't want to play the game, you can't get into it. You've got to spend, and you've got to be aware that every time I spend and every time he spends, what are we saying to some moderate income person? Don't bother, Bob. Don't bother with politics. It's not real.
The system did not reward Fenwick's virtuous campaign behavior.
People stop you in the street, look at you and say, go get him, Millie. That's the kind of poll I like.
She had been outspent and outmaneuvered by an opponent who held himself to a different standard. It was the first election Millicent Fenwick ever lost.
I woke up the next morning. I couldn't believe it. I'd had a 20-point lead in the polls. The following morning, Thursday, I woke up and thought, it's in the hands of God. I'm not going to even think about it. What I didn't do that I should have done, what he shouldn't have done that he did, I mean, I'm not going to think about it. I went back to Washington to clean up in my office, sitting there, and the White House called, would you come over at 2 o'clock? I went over at 2 o'clock. 2 nice young people. Would you be interested in serving the administration? I said yes, if I thought I could be useful.
Fenwick then served the Reagan administration as a United Nations envoy until her retirement in 1988. Meanwhile, the character she inspired remained in Congress until 1990, when she suddenly resigned as a matter of principle and honor. Lacey Davenport, Gary Trudeau's heroine of Capitol Hill, said she should have seen that Congress was allowing America's savings and loans to be turned into casinos. As always, Doonesbury's heroine was setting a high moral standard for her colleagues, even at her own expense.
Oh, you know, I liked Lacey. I really did. Lacey had no vengeance. She gave jobs to people who'd worked against her in the election. She was not self-interested. She was not impressed, either with herself or with anybody else. If she thought something was so, Lacey was apt to say so. She was comic, absolutely comic, but we're all comic. I mean, that's one thing that we have, this marvelous thing that we share, this human family.
The participation of Hispanic Americans only for having a different culture and speaking a different language.
Will the
like
gentleman,
faster.
will the colleague yield?
Not right now.
Voglio parlare un momentino per gli altri che sono qui. Voglio parlare anche per gli italiani, che anche loro hanno una cultura.
Perfetto.
You know, the other day, someone said, what would you like written on your gravestone? I suppose at 78 people begin to ask you this kind of thing. I don't know. But what I would hope would be, if you tried to be useful, somehow to make this whole trip through life so that other people can make use of it too. I think that's very important. Courage and force and determination and zeal, all wonderful qualities. And they can be the marks of the most terrible and cruel man. The really essential characteristic is compassion. In other words, do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. I really think that about sums it up.